Okay, thank you for having me. I have some confessions, but I'm actually going to give them in a few slides' time, and there's a reason for that. As mentioned, my name is David Eyes. I'm Head of Business Development for Data Interchange. We are specialists in supply integration. My particular role, as well as doing the business development, I'm also one of the authors of the Automotive Supply Chain Standard, MMOG. That particular standard is a mandatory requirement for every supplier to Ford, GM, PSA, Jaguar Land Rover, Volvo, Renault, Nissan, and soon to be some of the VW group, depending on which ones survive the scandal. It's a way to try and help standardise the supply chain for every single supplier. And what I'm going to show you is how we're using that to improve the performance of the supply chain in the SMEs. Now, I did say I'm going to make some confessions. The first thing is big data is not new. I'm an automotive child. I'm 43 years old, but I've been in automotive since I was born. The reason I say that is because my father was a purchasing director in an OEM. My mother was a shipping clerk at one particular OEM that used to own half of Dagenham. I remember when I was 8 years old, sitting around the dinner table, listening to my mum and dad have a huge argument as to which department within Ford was responsible for stopping the line. Purchasing were blaming the incoming goods people because the goods didn't get to the line on time, and the incoming goods people were blaming purchasing because purchasing never told them what they'd ordered, and therefore when all the goods turned up, they couldn't get the right goods to the line. So it was inevitable that I ended up in automotive in some respect. But big data is not new. Those of you that remember piano paper, the bill of material for one shift at Ford made the phone book look like a children's bedtime story because it was huge. And that information had to be shared down the entire supply chain. And again, how big is that supply chain? How many of us really understand just how big, just from a UK perspective, the automotive industry is? The amount of data that is in use is huge, and the amount of suppliers. There are 6,500 tier ones that are common across the OEMs. That doesn't actually sound like a huge amount, but those 6,500 suppliers are responsible for 25,000 parts for every single car that's built. That's the average number of parts per car from a tier one perspective. What is really scary is when we look at the next stat. In 2014, there were 65 million cars and other automobiles built. We hear about the performance of one individual OEM, but when you add all of that together, last year alone there were 65 million vehicles built. You times that by 25,000 parts in every single car. We're looking at a distribution network of nearly 1.6 trillion parts between tier one and the OEM. That's huge. And if you look at the amount of data that is required to deliver that at the right place at the right time. And I will tell you some very interesting and very scary changes coming shortly. But what's really important, and what we just don't seem to focus on, is 6,500 tier one suppliers supplying 1.6 trillion parts. But supporting those 6,500 tier ones are 34,000 tier twos. So if you look at the increase between tier one and tier two, does that mean that there is also the same increase in the number of parts? Is that the same increase in the amount of data? But the scary thing is, you would have thought that if the problem is fivefold, tenfold, then surely their maturity, their capability, their IT capability is equal to that. But in fact, it's the opposite. The further down the supply chain you go, the worse the IT capability becomes, the less their skill resource becomes, the less their understanding of accurate and efficient supply chain processes becomes. And that's the challenge that we have. both in UK, in Europe and across the world. One of the gentlemen mentioned earlier that there is a lack of women. I disagree. There's a lack of anyone. Yes, there is a lack of women, I do accept that. But look around the room. 90% of us are the silver side of 40. And you walk around any supply chain department and you see the same. Men towards the end of their career. You talk about logistics, you talk about supply chain to the younger people, all they think about is truck drivers. Oh, I'm not doing that. Most people don't actually understand just how big a career there is in supply chain. And until we can tap into that, we're still going to have the same challenges that we have now within the tier 2, tier 3 and beyond. And again, that's part of what we're trying to do, is educate the tier 2s, the tier 3s and the people that don't think that there is a career in supply chain on actually all of the best practices, all of this ability to use data. It's not just for the sievers, it's not just for the Port Felixstows. We can give the smallest supplier the access to that same level of data and use it efficiently. 20 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. 20 years ago, only the big boys could have that level of accuracy of data. Now there are systems and tools to completely automate a supply chain process that can run from a laptop. I know, I've got one on there. And it's educating people that anybody can benefit from all the work that has been done by the universities, by the big organisations such as SEVA. What I'm going to look at is the big challenges. The big challenge that we have is getting that data down the supply chain. The scale and the requirement of data is enormous. I was speaking to one company this morning. They are a supplier of temporary staff to the NHS. They receive 10,000 orders a week, manually. They receive 10,000 timesheets. And they have to submit 10,000 invoices. All of that is done manually. And we wonder why there are efficiency problems in industries such as the NHS. All of that can be used using the same experience that we've learned across supply chain. Doesn't matter whether we work within food, within retail, within automotive, within public or private sector. Supply chain process is the same. Somebody is buying something. Somebody is responsible for making it, somebody is responsible for delivering it. We can use our experience across all of our sectors to help everybody. The process that we have, as we mentioned, it starts with a customer requirement. The biggest problem that most industries have is knowing, what does my customer want? I need to know what my customer wants early. The sooner I understand that, the sooner I can start to understand my process. Now that's really difficult, because what the OEMs, what the supermarkets are trying to do is predict what we want. There was one particular OEM this year, they launched a new van. They'd based their entire year's planning on statistics that they'd gathered. The first month of the launch, they were 60% wrong in what they thought people were going to buy. They thought everybody would go for the cheaper options. And this was just on lights. They had 5 different types of lighting system. They had the automatic all-day turn on and off LEDs, the very expensive option, all the way down to your manual, I'll only turn it on when I think it's dark enough and I need it. They expected that 60% of white van man drivers would go for the cheap option. So their costing and their planning was with one supplier to deliver the cheap lights. Unfortunately, 60% of their orders were asking for the high end. That particular supplier was getting a premium cost for a low volume. Suddenly that supplier has got a huge smile on his face, because instead of getting orders for a few thousand, he was getting orders for tens of thousands. The problem was he couldn't make them quick enough. The supplier that was expecting tens of thousands at low cost was suddenly getting orders for single thousands. understanding that demand and sharing it with our supply chain as quick as we can is very, very important. Again, how many tier ones do we know don't share their data for 5 or 6 days? By the time they've told their suppliers what they need, the customer's actually changed his mind. The sharing of data from the customer requirements down is crucial. That demand, that reliability of demand, gives us the ability to determine from forecast to order. If we don't have that data, how do I know what stock to have? My backup to that is to have huge amounts of safety stock. That costs money to move, it costs money to store. And heaven forbid there's a recall, because all of those goods are now completely worthless. And then I have to pay to move them again. If we look through the process, that data is not just about understanding that big mine of data at one level. It's sharing it across my internal and external supply chain. My demand data drives my planning. My planning drives my scheduling of my operations. It drives my suppliers. If I don't know what my customer wants, I don't know what materials I've got, I don't know what to manufacture. One of the things that most organisations really don't understand is supply chain drives the start of the process and the end of the process. It's the supply chain people that are delivering the raw materials to make the goods. And they're also the people that are picking those goods up and delivering them to the end customer. Maybe delivering it at 3 different points. Because you're delivering the raw materials to the tier ones. The tier ones make their goods. You pick them up, you take them to the OEM. When the OEM's made your cars, you're responsible for picking those cars up and distributing them around the world. If we go through that entire process, the minute we have inconsistent data, we are causing risk. Just a little fact, there is one OEM in the UK that if a supplier stops their line for 1 minute, they are fined £60,000. What they don't actually tell you is it takes 6 minutes to start the line. So immediately that's a £360,000 fine for one line stop, for 1 minute, or each car that doesn't get built according to plan. That's the penalty for not understanding and sharing the data. If we keep going through, again, that inconsistent data can then mean we are unable to actually fulfill our customer requirements. The effect is quite significant. And the biggest risk to the supply chain, if I don't understand what my customer requires and I cannot determine that accurately, how do I know I'm going to get paid for the right goods that I've actually delivered? Again, how many times do we hear suppliers not getting paid? And the effect of them not getting paid means they can't pay their suppliers. And the reason they can't pay is because they can't match goods received against the order made and against the invoice presented. Because at some point in that process it's gone manual. The supply chain process is a collaboration between purchasing, between the material handling teams, and between finance. Again, one of the biggest issues that we have in the SME industry is payment of services, payment of goods, and the effect that has. OEMs don't pay their tier ones, therefore the tier ones can't pay the tier two. Tier 2 puts the tier 1 on stop. He doesn't care. You haven't paid for my materials. The tier 1 then stops the OEM. The tier 1 then gets a £60,000 per minute fine. It's a massively vicious circle. So the use of that data is massively important. But the challenge is getting it down to the smallest supplier. You may be $1 billion organisation, but Fred in the shed round the corner can stop you, because he hasn't got the access to the data he needs to deliver the right goods at the right time. The way that we can actually help the SMEs, help these organisations understand the importance of best practice systems is by looking at calculating the costs of inaction. Before you immediately say, no, we can't afford that system, no, we can't afford that process, we can't afford to get the University of Essex to come in and do this analysis. Understand how much money you're losing already. How much are you wasting on emergency transport? because you couldn't ship to your normal timeline. You couldn't ship using the less expensive sea freight. You've had to ship by premium air to save those 3 days, 3 weeks. How much are you losing because you're not getting paid on time? These are all the elements that we can show the suppliers of how the use of big data, pushing it down their supply chain, can drive efficiency. Not just from a CO2 perspective, but actually protecting their working capital. One of the projects that we're working at the moment is to enable suppliers in the middle of the chain have a virtual cash flow. So they can actually see guaranteed invoice payments based on accurate data. And they can also see the guaranteed commitments they have to their suppliers by using the electronic messaging process. Electronic orders matched to electronic delivery notes, matched to electronic invoicing. And they're getting commitment of their invoice payment within 3 minutes of the goods actually arriving at the customer's location. Not 28 days later when somebody's actually found the paper dispatch note and been able to determine that the dispatch note does match what was delivered. And yes, we can see that that particular buyer did order it. I know some suppliers that have 130-day payment terms, and yet it takes 60 days for their invoice to even be accepted. And we wonder why our SMEs are struggling. There is going to be a huge focus from the government on paying SMEs. The UK government are mandating the adoption of the electronic purchase to pay process. Every government department must implement it by 2018. What they haven't yet told them is they're also going to make it a mandatory requirement that the government departments pay their suppliers within 5 days of the receipt of goods. So from 5 days from the goods arriving at a hospital, at a police station, at a fire station, they must be paid. How are they going to do that using the current processes? Matching paper to paper. They're going to need the expert advice of organisations such as SEVA, such as us, using best practices that we've done in the private sector. I'm just going to quickly talk about MMOG. MMOG stands for Materials Management Operational Guidelines Logistics Evaluation. It's a hell of a phrase. It started as 2 standards, as is normally the case. There was an American version and there was a European version. The problem is if you were a supplier to an OEM that had a location in both continents, you had to adopt 2 completely different processes. Again, that was cost inefficient. So about 10 years ago, they came together and bought them and created one standard. It's a common industry-wide set of best practices, and it's been signed and agreed by all of the major OEMs. It's not supposed to be a punishment tool. It's a way to identify the maturity and capabilities of suppliers and give them goals to achieve. This is the best practice. Tell us where you are today and let us help you close those gaps to make you become more efficient and more streamlined. It's a standard that can be adopted by any organisation. It's not just about the big tier 1 suppliers. There will be a huge push over the next 18 to 24 months to get this standard into tier 2s and tier 3s, having the same order process from OEM to tier 1 to tier 2 and down, the same delivery process and the same payment process. It's designed to eliminate supply chain risk. The automotive industry is very arrogant in the way that it works. It thinks that they are the best at everything. Yeah, we invented just in time. Yep, but you never mastered it. You look at the way they behave when they implemented just in time and sequencing. All they did was took all the risk and all the cost and put it into the tier 1 supply chain. Now we've got to help the tier 1s mitigate that risk, bring their tier 2s into the same standard. There's a huge focus across many industries about continuous improvement and lean. I challenge any organisation to demonstrate where they've taken a continuous improvement that has made their company better and that they've shared and taught one of their suppliers the same. That's Continuous improvement is about helping everybody in your supply chain become better. Yet so many organisations they keep their knowledge to themselves. Real continuous improvement is pushing that improvement down the supply chain. That's what MMOG is designed to do. It's an opportunity for the OEMs to understand the wider challenges in their supply chain and start to create positive, proactive training to educate their tier ones. The OEMs seem to think that that the tier ones are training their tier twos. No, they're not. They're too busy trying to keep the OEMs happy. Tier ones don't trust their customers. They won't admit to failure because they're scared that their customers will penalise them. We have to break that cycle. We have to start working together and sharing our knowledge. It's an opportunity for the tier ones to provide the larger manufacturers, the OEMs, with an honest and accurate picture of what it's like to work for them. To look at what are the real challenges and the real failures in that supply chain. And implement best practices and push them down the supply chain. Again, if we look at automotive, we look at retail, we look at the food industry. Yes, we've all adopted EDI, but we've all implemented different standards. We're all using 3PLs, but those 3PLs now have to adopt EDIFACT for European automotive, VDA if it's Germany, EDICOM if it's food, X12 if they're working in the US. The EU has now created a new European standard called PEPO. One standard regardless of what government industry you work in. Doesn't matter if you work for 100 NHS trusts, 30 police stations, 50 fire brigades. It's one type of order, one type of delivery note, one type of invoice. That's the level of standardisation and integration we need. And it needs us to start pressurising these industries to bring them together. And from a tier 2 perspective, finally they have the ability to access knowledge and the skill sets required to achieve global best practice. The last 20 years has always been focused on the 20% of suppliers that deliver the 80% of business. Well, what about the 80% of the suppliers that deliver the 20%? That's where most of the inefficiencies are now. And we need to start to help them to bring them forward. MMOG has 6 chapters. Each chapter is designed to eliminate waste and risk. I won't go through every single one, but I'm more than happy to send this presentation out to anybody that wants it. But it's about identifying gaps and identifying the solution. Every chapter brings benefit both to the customer and the supplier. Again, this initiative is not just about the customer benefit. This is about improving the supply chain all the way down. So it looks at, does the supplier have a strategy for improvement? Do they have a supply chain strategy both with their customer and with their tier 2s? It looks at the work organisation. Do we understand the processes and the roles within the work organisation? I know one particular OEM that their entire production line was stopped because one forklift driver went sick. A major global automotive manufacturer went down. 500 vehicles didn't get built properly because one forklift driver went sick. Nobody knew everything that forklift driver did. They didn't realise that he was a crucial part to the labelling of some of the packaging. So when he didn't come in, they got a temporary forklift driver came in. It was quite bizarre how this story went on. First thing that happened is the warehouse manager went to HR. Unfortunately, this was 6 o'clock in the morning. We don't have HR at 6 o'clock in the morning. So he rang up the agency and said, I need a forklift driver. Agency said, okay. What sort of licence? Driving licence? He had no documentation to help him. He then had to ring his manager, say, what sort of licences does these drivers need? Cut a long story short, he got it. Driver turned up. Driver walked in, said, right, I'm here. What do I do? Well, you drive a forklift. Okay, but what's the process? Well, you go to the end of the line, you pick up a pallet and you put it in the warehouse. Look at what number's on the pallet and you put it in the right slot. About 2 hours later, the logistics manager came in and he did his walk around his entire facility. Went to goods in, everything was running smooth. Walked around the line, everything was coming off. Went into the warehouse was nice and full. Went to goods out, absolute chaos. I said, what's going on? And the guy said, well, we can't find the right parts. Some of the parts haven't got the customer label on. So he said, well, why not? We said, well, we don't know. He then went back to speak to the other people. Why is the customer labels not on? Well, who puts it on? He said, well, Fred, forklift driver does it. Fred's gone sick. Sorry. About 3 hours later, they got a phone call from the OEM to say their entire production line had stopped because this particular supplier supplied two parts, a left-hand part and a right-hand part. They shipped 2 boxes. Each box had 500 parts in. Unfortunately, both boxes had left-hand parts. Every single one of those cars went into WIP. For the next 4 weekends, that supplier had to pay for all of the engineers to come in and retrofit those cars. Just because one job sheet was missing, one piece of data that couldn't be shared. Data is not just about huge amounts of numbers and spreadsheets. But it's about understanding all of that and sharing it. It's making sure that you have the plans in place to mitigate risk. Risk is not just about the volcano going off in Sweden or a tsunami hitting Japan. One person can be a risk. One planner. That planner is the only person that happens to have the spreadsheet on his laptop that runs your entire schedule. And he's the only person that knows the password to the spreadsheet. Again, I know one particular OEM that stopped for 2 days because one supplier's planner had a car accident. And nobody else in the company knew how their spreadsheets worked. The laptop was in the car that had the crash. They had to get special permission from the police to get access to the car. When they got the laptop, they didn't know the password to the Excel spreadsheet. They had to wait another 5 hours before the person who had the accident can contact them. When they opened the spreadsheet, they couldn't work out what the formulas did. So it's about understanding how you use the data and make sure you've mitigated the risks of how to use it properly. It's looking at the capacity and production planning. Again, that is a massive challenge to any supplier. Understanding my customer demand. Have they got it right? So many universities have been commissioned to work out forecasting models. Personally, I don't think they'll ever solve it. Because forecasting is all about trying to dictate what we want. And we change our minds every 30 seconds. You don't believe me? Just think about, if you've got children, think about the process of determining what do I buy my son and daughter for Christmas. When I first asked them, what do you want? Then think about what you actually got on Christmas Day. I did a simple experiment with my daughter a few years ago, and I asked her around October what she wanted. She said, yeah, I want this dolly, Daddy. Okay, fantastic. A couple of weeks later, I said, you still want that dolly? No, Daddy, I've changed my mind. We went through that process every 2 weeks, all the way up to Christmas. She changed her mind every single time. That's what we're like. That's human nature. And that's why forecasting would always be incredibly difficult. But understanding the impacts of that forecasting, your capacity and your production planning, and feeding it down your supply chain. It looks at the customer interface, the working relationship between me and my customer. Knowing who to call, when to call them. It's also making sure you have exactly the same process with your suppliers. So you're doing everything the same way. You think about it, as a tier 1, you do everything twice. You receive an order, you raise an order. You receive goods to create and ship goods. So you're receiving dispatch notes, you're creating dispatch notes. And you are sending invoices and raising invoices. All of that can be done in a single process using the same standards. It's looking to remove human risk. Again, one of the biggest problems with big data, the minute you bring in the human element, that data is contaminated. The amount of times people are sharing their orders using emails, and then you're manually typing it into a system, that data is contaminated, because I guarantee somebody will make a mistake. You're then sharing that contaminated data with your tier one. All of that affects the entire supply chain process. And it's trying to understand and create early warnings as soon as possible. Again, if I can get electronic delivery notes from my tier twos, the second those goods leave their deck, I know within seconds if they're short shipping me. You look at the manual process with tier twos at the moment. I've been there, I've done it, I've been on both sides of the telephone. You're a planner. You're running short of goods. You ring your supplier up. Fred, is that truck on its way? Yeah, it left 10 minutes ago. No, it's not. It's still sitting out on the deck. But I'm going to tell my driver to put his foot down. In the same conversation, are you sending me 1,000 parts? Yeah. No, he's sending you 900. The other 100 will become by premium freight. They'll be expedited on a courier. But what if that courier is late? By knowing exactly what's coming as early as possible, you give your customer the ability to make choices. That's where data becomes incredibly powerful. Again, if we look at the process that Siva have with the ships coming in, until they know what's on that ship, they cannot plan their unloading process. How many of the suppliers don't provide that data electronically? It's manual. And so until you get the data, you're not planning. It looks at the production and product control and the supplier interface, matching my supplier process to my customer process, and making sure I understand all of the information required for the flow of materials. This is a process and a standard that's being pushed throughout the automotive industry. 60% of all automotive cars currently use, 60% of all cars built currently follow this process. It won't be long before that figure is touching 80 or 90%. Single standard, single process. The key to the production and product is to drive out obsolescence, reducing the amount of safety stock. The reason we do that, the reason we want to do that, there is 2 OEMs in the UK that are changing the way the automotive industry works. How many of you know what the average order to delivery time of a car is? From the moment you walk into a dealer to the minute you pick your keys up. Anyone know? 12 weeks. One OEM has immediately slashed that to 6 weeks. Not only have they slashed the time, they are guaranteeing delivery to their customer within 6 weeks. They're also allowing that customer to change their mind. So you go into the dealer, you make your order. You're bespokely picking all of the options on your car. For the next 4 weeks, you can change your mind. You can go online and you can change any aspect of that car. Think about the problems that causes as a supplier. 6 weeks ago, all of the customers were choosing one particular radio. Now they've all changed their mind. How are we going to manage that? How are we going to adapt to that? There is another OEM that has gone even further and will allow a customer to go online and change aspects of the interior of their vehicle 30 seconds before the body hits the production line. They could change their entire entertainment system. The customer doesn't care that if I change the entertainment system, it also changes the entire wiring harness. It also changes the speakers, and because it changes the speakers, it also changes the door panels. And suppliers are getting 30 seconds notification. That's the level of demand that us as customers are asking for. So there needs to be a huge shift in the use of data and pushing it down that supply chain. And we're looking to help enable better cash management. We're looking to enable tier ones to be able to pay their tier twos more accurately and quicker. Because the tier twos have suppliers. It's about helping them manage their working capital. Because without that working capital, they can't invest in new processes, new systems, new skills, training, staff. There's a huge benefit to adopting the supply chain standards, to the P2B process, the use of data down the supply chain. We've seen suppliers reduce their inventory carrying costs by up to 50%. Their premium freight costs by 85%. This is probably the word Seaver don't want to hear. Reducing obsolescence by 80%. You think about the amount of recalls that have happened over the last 2 or 3 years. It's not the OEMs that have paid the price. It's the suppliers that have paid that penalty. Because the suppliers are only covered for about 7% safety stock, yet they're holding more than 20%. They pay the penalty of that. It's improving their delivery rating, and it's reducing their supplier training as well. Again, it's about looking at the skills matrix, looking to understand, do my suppliers have the skills and knowledge that we need them to enable us to satisfy our customers. That's what we call an integrated supply chain. Having the same flow of data from customer to tier 1 to tier 2, tier 2 to tier 3, both downstream and upstream. Electronic ordering all the way down. Electronic dispatch notes all the way up. Confirmation of delivery electronically, because that confirmation of delivery will drive accurate invoicing, and invoicing being electronic. And that's all the use of data. That's enough for me. I hope that was useful. Thank you.